You already know this story. A beautiful Egyptian queen, two of the most powerful men in Rome, a snake, a tragedy. Almost none of that is true. Cleopatra was not Egyptian. She was Macedonian Greek, the seventh queen of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a family that had ruled Egypt for 300 years without ever bothering to learn its language. She was the first one who did. She also learned Ethiopian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Parthian, and 4 other languages. Not because she was curious, because she understood that power flows through language. Through the ability to speak directly to every person you need something from, without an interpreter between you. She was not a passive beauty waiting to be rescued by Roman generals. She was the one who contacted Caesar, not the other way around. She arranged the meeting, she chose the timing, she chose the entrance. The famous story about being smuggled into his presence, rolled inside a carpet or a linen sack, because she needed to see him before her enemies in Alexandria could have her arrested or killed. She was 18 years old. She had already been in a civil war with her own brother for 2 years. The story everyone knows about Cleopatra was written by her enemies. Octavian, who defeated her, spent the rest of his very long life making sure the world remembered her as a seductress who had corrupted 2 great Roman men. He needed that story. The alternative, that she had nearly beaten him, that for 15 years she had played the most sophisticated diplomatic and military game in the Mediterranean world, that he had won not because she was weak but because he was just barely colder, was not a story that served his purposes. So he wrote a different one, and it stuck. This is the story Octavian did not want told. The story of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing, who made almost no mistakes, and who lost anyway, to a man who made fewer. When Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE, his empire was divided among his generals. Egypt went to a man named Ptolemy, who was smart enough to understand that ruling Egypt required something his Macedonian colleagues did not grasp. You had to become Egyptian, at least in public, at least in the temples. So the Ptolemies built temples in the Egyptian style. They presented themselves in hieroglyphs as pharaohs, wearing the double crown, performing the ancient rituals. In private, in their palace in Alexandria, they spoke Greek, ate Greek food, read Greek philosophy, and married their siblings, because Egyptian pharaonic tradition demanded it, and because keeping power within the family reduced the number of people who might try to take it from them. The result, after 300 years, was a dynasty that was deeply inbred, frequently murderous, and increasingly dependent on Rome. By the time Cleopatra was born, around 69 BCE, Egypt was nominally independent but practically a Roman client state. Her father, Ptolemy XII, had paid an enormous bribe to Julius Caesar and Pompey to be recognized as a legitimate king. The sum was so large, he had to raise taxes so dramatically that his own people revolted, and he had to flee to Rome. Cleopatra was Ptolemy XII's 3rd child. She had an older sister, Berenice, who took advantage of her father's absence to declare herself queen. When Ptolemy XII returned with Roman soldiers, he had Berenice executed. This was the family Cleopatra grew up in. Not a warning about what happened to people who challenged the throne. A lesson about what you had to be willing to do to keep it. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, he left the throne jointly to Cleopatra, then 18, and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, then 10. Joint rule between siblings was the Ptolemaic custom. It almost never worked. Within 2 years, Ptolemy XIII's advisors, effectively a regency council running the government through the child king, had pushed Cleopatra out of Alexandria. She raised an army in Syria, civil war, and then Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, chasing his enemy Pompey. Pompey was murdered on the beach before Caesar could meet him, killed by Ptolemy XIII's advisors, who thought this would please the Roman. It did not. Caesar was furious. He had wanted to capture Pompey himself. He installed himself in the royal palace and began demanding that the Ptolemaic siblings resolve their dispute. Cleopatra needed to meet him. Her brother's people controlled every entrance to the palace, so she had herself smuggled in. The ancient sources describe the meeting. They differ on the details of how she arrived. They agree on the outcome. Caesar was immediately and completely on her side. This is sometimes described as seduction. It was almost certainly more than that. It was a demonstration of exactly the qualities Caesar valued most. She had assessed the situation correctly. She had identified the risk, arrest before she could make her case, and solved it creatively. She had walked into a room with the most powerful man in the world, alone, having just come out of a laundry bag or a carpet roll, and presented herself not as a refugee, but as a queen. Caesar had seen a great deal of the world. He had not seen many people like this. He sided with Cleopatra. He forced a reconciliation that left her in power. When Ptolemy XIII's forces besieged the palace, Caesar fought them off. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile trying to escape. Cleopatra's younger sister Arsinoe, who had allied with Ptolemy XIII against her, was taken to Rome as a prisoner. Cleopatra was Queen of Egypt. She was 21 years old. It had cost her 2 siblings. The relationship between Cleopatra and Caesar lasted approximately 2 years, during which time she had his child, a son named Caesarion, Little Caesar. She visited Rome in 46 BCE, staying in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, receiving visitors, being seen. This visit is usually described as romantic. It was also political calculation of the highest order. Cleopatra needed Rome to continue recognizing her as the legitimate ruler of Egypt. Caesar needed a stable Egypt. Egypt controlled the grain supply that fed the Roman world. They needed each other. The fact that they apparently also liked each other was a bonus, not the reason. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, Cleopatra was still in Rome. She returned to Egypt immediately. She understood what it meant. The protection that came with being Caesar's ally had just been removed. The Roman world was about to tear itself apart over who would inherit his power. Egypt was going to be a prize in that contest. She needed to be on the right side. The Roman civil war that followed Caesar's death produced on one side Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, 19 years old, apparently unpromising, and Mark Antony, Caesar's most experienced general, on the other side. Against them, Brutus and Cassius, the men who had organized the assassination. At the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, Octavian and Antony defeated Brutus and Cassius. The empire was then divided between them, Antony taking the east, Octavian the west. Egypt was in Antony's territory. Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus in 41 BCE. He wanted money and supplies for his campaign against Parthia. She came, but she came in a way that transformed the meeting from a summons into an arrival. She arrived by boat, dressed as Aphrodite, with elaborate theatrical staging designed to make the entire city come down to the waterfront to watch. Antony, waiting on his tribunal, found himself sitting alone because everyone in Tarsus had gone to see her. She did not go to him. He came to her. For dinner on her ship. This was not seduction. This was a negotiation opening move. She was establishing, from the first moment, that she was not a vassal coming to pay tribute. She was an equal. Or at least she was going to be treated as one. The relationship between Cleopatra and Antony lasted 11 years and produced 3 children. It was also the central strategic alliance of Antony's Eastern Empire. Egypt funded his campaigns. Egyptian grain fed his armies. Cleopatra was not a distraction from Antony's political ambitions. She was the financial foundation of them. In return, Antony gave her something she needed: Roman military support for expanding Ptolemaic territory. He restored to her control the eastern Mediterranean territories that previous Ptolemies had lost: Cyprus, parts of Syria, portions of the Levantine coast. He was reconstructing the Ptolemaic Empire. They both understood what the other needed. This is what made the alliance work for as long as it worked. But there was a problem. Antony was already married to Octavia, Octavian's sister. His marriage to Cleopatra in 37 BCE by Egyptian rite gave Octavian exactly the propaganda weapon he had been waiting for. A Roman general had abandoned his Roman wife for an Egyptian queen. He was bewitched. He was corrupted. He had betrayed Rome. Octavian spent the next 7 years building that story while simultaneously building the navy and army that would make it unnecessary to tell. Gaius Octavius was 19 when Caesar was assassinated. He was slight, frequently ill, not obviously a military commander. When he arrived in Rome to claim Caesar's inheritance, Antony treated him with contempt. Cicero thought he could be used and discarded. Most people who encountered him early in his career made the same mistake. They looked at the physical appearance, the youth, the apparent pliability, and concluded he was manageable. He was not manageable. He was simply patient in a world that rewarded impatience. Octavian's genius was not military. He was a mediocre general who won battles by finding excellent generals to fight them for him. His genius was political and narrative. He understood, better than anyone of his age, that the story you tell about yourself and your enemies is as important as anything that happens on a battlefield. He worked on the story of Cleopatra and Antony for years before the war that would decide everything. The picture Octavian constructed was precise and durable. Antony had not made a political alliance with a foreign queen. He had been enslaved by her. She had used her feminine wiles, this was the specific language, to corrupt a great Roman man. Antony did not make decisions anymore. Cleopatra made them for him. The Eastern campaign failures were her fault. The donations of Roman territory to her children were her idea. The will Octavian claimed to have found in a temple in Rome, in which Antony supposedly left everything to Cleopatra and asked to be buried in Alexandria, whether that will was real or fabricated, was devastating. Rome did not declare war on Antony. Rome declared war on Cleopatra. The distinction was tactical genius. It meant that every Roman soldier fighting for Antony was technically fighting against a foreign enemy rather than in a Roman civil war. It meant that Antony's Italian supporters were defending a man who had been enchanted by an enemy. not a Roman political faction with legitimate grievances. Cleopatra understood what was happening. She understood it clearly. She had good intelligence networks. She knew what Octavian was saying about her in Rome, and she knew why. She could not counter it effectively from Alexandria. Every response she made could be folded back into the narrative of a scheming foreign queen interfering in Roman affairs. The decisive engagement came in September 31 BCE at Actium, on the western coast of Greece. The naval battle is one of the most analyzed and least understood engagements in ancient history. What is clear is that Cleopatra's fleet withdrew during the battle, and Antony followed her. Ancient sources, almost all of them Octavian's, say she fled in panic, and Antony abandoned his men for love of her. Modern historians suggest something more strategic, that the battle was already going badly, that Cleopatra and Antony executed a planned breakout to preserve their forces and retreat to Egypt, where they still had resources to fight. It does not matter which interpretation is correct. What matters is that Octavian controlled the story afterward. The retreat became a rout. The breakout became an abandonment. Antony's remaining forces, without their commander, surrendered. Cleopatra and Antony retreated to Alexandria. They had 1 year. Cleopatra spent the year after Actium doing two things simultaneously: negotiating with Octavian and preparing for a war she increasingly suspected she would not be allowed to fight. The negotiations were sophisticated. She sent Octavian gifts and proposals. She offered to abdicate in favor of her children. She offered Egypt's treasury, which was enormous, as a payment for peace. She explored the possibility of Octavian simply taking Egypt as a province and leaving the Ptolemaic dynasty intact in some reduced form. Octavian accepted her gifts and gave her nothing in return. He was playing for time while his forces moved toward Alexandria. He told her, through intermediaries, that he would treat her with consideration. He did not specify what that meant. She knew what it meant. She had watched what happened to her sister Arsinoe, taken to Rome as a prisoner and marched through the streets of the city in Caesar's triumph. She knew that Octavian intended to do the same with her, the greatest propaganda prize in the world. The foreign queen who had corrupted 2 Roman generals, displayed in chains before the Roman people. Antony's forces collapsed when Octavian's army arrived outside Alexandria in July of 30 BCE. His cavalry and fleet defected. He received a false report that Cleopatra was dead, possibly a miscommunication, possibly something more deliberate, and fell on his sword. He did not die immediately. He was carried to the mausoleum where Cleopatra had barricaded herself and died there. Cleopatra then attempted one more negotiation with Octavian. She met with him in person. He was polite, gave nothing away, and left soldiers to ensure she remained alive and in Alexandria. He needed her for the triumph. What happened next is one of the best documented and most debated deaths in ancient history. The ancient sources agree on the outcome. Cleopatra died on August 12, 30 BCE, in her mausoleum. The cause was suicide. The method is disputed. The snake story is famous but not certain. Plutarch, writing over a century later, notes that no one actually saw what happened. There were 2 small puncture wounds on her arm. There may have been a snake. There may have been poison from another source. What is not disputed is the effect. When Octavian received word that she was dead, he was reportedly furious. He had sent men specifically to prevent it. He had planned the triumph around her. She had known this. She had made the only move left available to her. Octavian could parade her body through Rome, but a body is not a triumph. A living queen in chains, walking behind the chariot, that is a triumph. A corpse is just a corpse. He had taken everything else from her. She took this from him. He buried her with Antony, as she had requested, with full royal honors. It was the only thing she asked for that he gave her. Octavian became Augustus, the first Roman emperor, though he was careful never to use that word. He was the restorer of the Republic, the man who had saved Rome from a foreign enchantress and the weak Roman who had succumbed to her. The entire ideological foundation of his regime rested partly on the contrast between his cold Roman virtue and the dangerous Eastern luxury that had corrupted Antony. This meant Cleopatra had to remain, in the official memory, exactly what he had made her: a seductress, a manipulator, a warning. Any revision of that story would destabilize the founding myth of the Augustan age. So the story persisted. It was repeated by the historians of the empire who depended on imperial favor. It passed into Shakespeare, into Hollywood, into every Cleopatra costume ever worn at a fancy dress party. For 2,000 years, the woman who had spoken 9 languages, governed Egypt for 21 years, outmaneuvered every political threat she faced for 2 decades, and in the end chose the terms of her own death rather than let her enemy choose them for her. That woman was remembered primarily as a seductress. Modern scholarship has been systematically dismantling the Augustan version for the last 50 years. The ancient coins that show her face, real coins, made during her lifetime, not romanticized portraits, show a strong-featured woman with a prominent nose and a diadem. Not the face of Hollywood, the face of someone who intended to be taken seriously. The Ptolemaic administrative records that have been recovered show an active, engaged ruler. Tax policies, agricultural management, religious appointments. She was running a country with a complex bureaucracy, a multilingual population, competing religious institutions, and the constant pressure of Roman demands. She ran it for 21 years. Caesarion, her son by Caesar, was killed by Octavian after her death. He was 17. Octavian's advisor Arius reportedly quoted Homer, "Too many Caesars is not good." Her 3 children by Antony were taken to Rome and raised by Octavia, Antony's Roman wife, whose sister Cleopatra had displaced. That detail contains entire worlds. There is a version of Cleopatra's death that is not tragedy. It is strategy, executed to the end. She had one thing Octavian could not take from her by force: her own willingness to die. As long as she lived, she was his prize. The moment she chose to die, she became his problem. He could not display a corpse. He could not build a triumph around an empty litter. He had to bury her with honors he had not planned to give her, in the tomb she had prepared herself. She managed the end as she had managed everything else, not perfectly. She had run out of moves before she ran out of intelligence. But the last move was hers. She was 39 years old. The city of Alexandria that Cleopatra ruled no longer exists in the form she knew it. The great library, which she almost certainly used, is gone. The lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, is gone. The royal palace complex where she met Caesar is under the harbor. submerged by the earthquakes and subsidence of centuries. Archaeologists have been searching for her tomb for decades. It has not been found. What remains are the coins, the administrative documents, the inscriptions in temples where she is shown as pharaoh, in the traditional Egyptian style, making offerings to gods she had learned to honor because ruling Egypt required it. And the story Octavian told, which is still being told, which is why, 2,000 years later, when you hear the name Cleopatra, you think of a snake and a love story. She would have found that infuriating. She would also have understood exactly how it happened, and who needed it to be that way, and why. That was the thing about Cleopatra. She always understood. It just was not always enough.